Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Turning Towards Life. This is Lizzie and Justin, and we are here in our Sunday rhythm of always coming and turning up and having a conversation and talking to one another about some kind of source, some kind of inspiration, some kind of leading light into wondering about life, turning towards life. And this week we have a source chosen by Justin from the incredible Earthsea books by Ursula Le Guin, which is very, very wonderful. And I think we've bought something of Ursula Le Guin before. And I feel very grateful for the mystery of it, for the feeling of, oh my gosh, I'm not even sure what this is saying. And knowing these days that that's always the sign of something wonderful about to happen, rather than a sign of, oh no, I'm not going to be able to make any kind of contribution or something. So I'm very glad to be here with you, Justin, and wandering into this wonder that you've shared with us today and that we're going to talk about together.
Such a morning, Lizzie, and morning, everyone. I just want to, before I say anything else, want to add my welcome to all of you who are with us, some of whom are brand new and some of whom have been with us for a very, very long time. And we've been doing this for a very long time, Lizzie, which I'm very glad for too. It's always such, I don't want to use the wrong words, it's both a challenge and an opportunity and an excitement and a creative act for me whenever I'm choosing a source for turning towards life, because we're trying not to repeat sources, although maybe we will at some point, because the world is full of things for us to study together and talk about together and learn from together. And we never know where a source is going to lead. But I've wanted to bring something from Earthsea for a while. And I've wanted to bring this in particular because this little passage we're going to read had such an impact on me many, many, many years ago, and I've carried it round with me, often on a piece of paper, as a sort of reminder, which is why I wanted to bring it. And Lizzie, I was at a conference yesterday, which I really enjoyed, about how we might live in these very complex times, what kind of values and practices we might live by. And one of the speakers, whose name is Elizabeth Oldfield, I don't know if you've ever come across her and her work, Lizzie, was talking about sacred practices. And one of the things she talked about is about how important having shared practices that you do with other people that bring the sacredness of life to bear is in times where so many of us feel so disconnected and so lonely in the midst of things. And she talked about, as I've often thought about the principle of, many, many people in the world have sacred texts. Certainly in my own spiritual and religious life, there are sacred texts, or at least texts that are invested with a certain kind of importance that are worth studying. And Elizabeth was saying, yeah, and you can study any text that way, which is, I know, is what we've been doing for a long time, which is you take something that somebody's written and treat it as if it were serious enough and deep enough and sacred enough that if you bring the right kind of attention to it, something can happen. So I wanted to say that because that's what I think we're doing. And I particularly feel that about, as it happens, about Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea novels, from which this source comes. I think they're a proper kind of sacred text and really worth reading and really worth studying. So for all of you who are with us, the background, you can always find the source on our very, very lovely Turning Towards Life website, just beautifully put together and has everything, all the conversations that we've had all the way through there. And you can find it in the YouTube video, search for Turning Towards Life on YouTube, and in our Facebook group, which you're very welcome to join. Turning Towards Life, of course, and you can also read it in the notes that go out in all the podcast versions on all the different podcast platforms. So this is called One Word Spoken Slowly by the Stars. It's from the first book of the Earthsea books. And just by way of a little bit of background before we read this, because it comes from a novel, so it's unusual, Lizzie, for us. We rarely have a source that comes in the middle of a story somewhere. So what's really helpful to know is that there are 3 people in this. One of them is called Ged, and he is a wizard. And at this point in the book, he's on a long journey to find a dark shadow, really the shadow side of himself, that he unleashed into the world many years before when he was a young man in an act of boastfulness and superiority and bravado. So he's trying to find it. It's been chasing him and now he's pursuing it. So there's Ged, there's Yarrow, who's the youngest sister of Ged's friend, Vetch, and Mer, who is Vetch and Yarrow's middle brother. So there we go. So this is one word spoken slowly by the stars. I, Ged, answered. Light is a power, a great power by which we exist, but which exists beyond our needs in itself. Sunlight and starlight are time, and time is light. And in the sunlight, in the days and years, life is. In a dark place, life may call upon the light, naming it. There was a little pause, and Yarrow asked, tell me just this, if it's not a secret. What other great powers are there besides the light? It's no secret. All power is one in source and end, I think. Years and distances, stars and candles, water and wind and wizardry, the craft in a man's hand and the wisdom in a tree's root, they all arise together. My name and yours and the true name of the sun or a spring of water or an unborn child are all syllables of a great word that is very slowly spoken by the shining of the stars. There is no other power, no other name. Staying on his knife on the carved wood, Mer asked, what of death? Yarrow listened, her shining black head bent down. For a word to be spoken, Ged answered slowly, there must be silence before and after.
Thanks, Justin. One word spoken slowly by the stars. I, Ged answered, light is a power, a great power by which we exist, but which exists beyond our needs in itself. Sunlight and starlight are time, and time is light. In the sunlight, in the days and years, life is. In a dark place, life may call upon the light, naming it. There was a little pause, and Yarrow asked, tell me just this, if it is not a secret, what other great powers are there besides the light? It's no secret. All power is one in source and end, I think. Years and distances, stars and candles, water and wind and wizardry, the craft in a man's hand and the wisdom in a tree's root, they all arise together. My name and yours, and the true name of the sun, or a spring of water, or an unborn child, are all syllables of the great word that is very slowly spoken by the shining of the stars. There is no other power, no other name. Staying his knife on the carved wood, Mer asked, what of death? Yarrow listened, her shining black head bent down. For a word to be spoken, Ged answered slowly, there must be silence, before and after.
Thank you, Lizzie. Well, there's lots in here, of course. But actually, what brought me to this and has lived with me for such a long time, and why I wanted to bring it, is this line: my name and yours, and the true name of the sun, or a spring of water, or an unborn child, are all syllables of the great word that is very slowly spoken by the shining of the stars. I remember reading this. Maybe, Lizzie, I read this book when I was 11 first, and then when I was 14, and then I came back to it in my 30s, and I've come back to it in my 40s, and I've come back to it in my 50s, and maybe the third or fourth time that I read this, I felt on reading that line for the first time something that seems absolutely true and which I forget so often. And when I forget it, I feel at my most lonely and my most separate from the world and the most separate from life. And the thing that I remembered through hearing Ged speak these words at this point in the book is that we are, all of us, each of us, not the separate, buffered selves that we so easily take ourselves to be, but one part of a great word being spoken very, very slowly over time. Like we are, it seems to me, life speaking itself and life coming to know itself through us, as it's knowing itself through the stars and the sun and the unborn child and the craft of our hands and the roots of a tree, all of it. And it feels very important to me to remember this and to say this, because one of the challenges I think any of us face at this moment in the life of the world is that we live in the midst of stories that tell us mostly that the most important thing is that we're separate from one another. We prize individuality, and individuality has a lot going for it too. So I'm not trying to say one story has to replace the other. But if we only know ourselves as individuals, if we only know ourselves as separate, and particularly if we live in a story about the world, that the world is, that existence itself is mechanistic, it's some great big computer or some great big mechanism or some great big machine of which we have to contend with. And particularly with the way that technology, which of course we're using technology here now, but technology can serve either to bring us in close, but can very often serve to isolate us, so that we end up scrolling through endless things and in a way being subject to other people's ideas about what's important and what we should be seeing. And particularly if we forget to get outside and get our bodies against a tree or against the ground, or to look at the sky and take in the sun. Or particularly if I forget that you, Lizzie, are also one syllable of a great word that's being very slowly spoken by the whole of existence. When I forget all of that, it's no wonder that we feel so alone and so separate, and I think so desperate. Like, how on earth am I to make sense of my life if all I am is some random collection of random stuff that's randomly bouncing around? And we need stories that will locate ourselves in our place in everything and in the sacredness of everything. And last part that feels very important to me, in a world where we've banished a lot of the myths and stories, we've banished a lot of the myths and stories of the religious paths, and we've treated myths and stories as if they were trivial, and so shallowed all of that. It's really, really hard for us to find this sense, which I increasingly think is the truer of the senses, which is the marvel and wonder of finding ourselves here at all in the midst of something that is, as Ged says at the beginning, there's a great power by which we exist, but exists way beyond our needs. It's not about me and it's not about you. in fact, the other way around, we're about it. My life isn't really about me, but I am about life. And this little part of the story does such a beautiful, beautiful job of bringing all of that into play.
Mm. As usual, I'm wondering which thread to pull on. The last thing you said, Justin, about the light and the way that Ursula Le Guin says it here, that life is itself, feels very real and important to me. Like there's the stories we tell, and maybe there's a story that I'm telling about life, but this kind of separation about life itself and how it can call on the light. Like that life and light are in relationship with each other. They are separated out in this passage, but that life itself is alive, of course, and in aliveness is consciousness and energy that is making the world and what's the word? Breathing life into, invigorating, making alive everything that's here. That life feels to me like a benevolent force, that it, in order that in the dark life might call upon the light, so in a dark place life may call upon the light, naming it. That to me feels like Ursula Le Guin is trying to say to us that life itself in its benevolence would do that. That's what happens. That's a possibility, that life itself calls on the light when there is darkness present. And I feel like that is like an underpinning of everything for me. I know I talk about faith a lot, and I think that's what it feels very important to keep on returning to. Whatever the cynicism or whatever the difficulty with that we have, that is the place that seems true to me. Like the sun rises every day. I feel the benevolence of that. A plant, if left in the light, will reach towards it. Like things are connected, and there is benevolence and beauty where there is life. And even when there is hard life, like concrete, we've talked about flowers growing through the concrete, life itself is powerfully and in a very strong way reaching for itself. And this whole thing about light and power, it feels very, very mysterious to me. And thank God for mystery is how I feel about that. Because the where that mystery leads me is not in to the places that I keep being led, like you were saying. Mystery leads me to my curiosity and my wondering and my openness. Whereas all of the stories of individuality and, which sometimes help, but on a deep level, it doesn't really help me. On a deep level, what really helps me is this feeling of life's benevolence and the power and the light being extremely strong. It's not even, that's even too little a thing to say about it. But there's a way that when things become mysterious, when they get revealed to me as mysterious by people like Ursula Le Guin and countless others, it feels like a relief. It really feels like a relief. I was reading this kind of graphic version of Sapiens by, you're going to have to tell me his name, Noah Yuval Harari, this morning. And one of the little lines in it, which kind of goes through the kind of a brief history of time, is like 200 years ago when family and community got put to the side for industry and economics. And for some reason that stopped me in my tracks of like, oh my gosh, like when I realized that we've constructed everything. We've made the world that we're living in, and now it's having its way with us. But we're all part of making the story of individuality and economics being the most important thing, and we are the makers of that, and now it's got us. That threw me this morning into like the mystery of, okay, well, if I made all of this, if we made all of this, then I can unmake anything too, in one sense. And so I feel very grateful for the mystery. Oh, and by the way, there's this other thought that's here too of, and I don't know the exact reference point, but there's somebody who, I think there's a TED talk or something, and I haven't watched it yet, so it's a bit strange that I'm talking about it, but I think it's called A Stroke of Insight, and a woman has a stroke and talks about her experience of having the stroke. And I haven't seen it, so I don't know all the detail, but somebody was telling me that the piece of her brain where the stroke was the part that makes boundaries. So as in knows the difference between this being my body and this not being my body, and the distinction between different things. That part got in some way undone by the stroke. And she was able to reflect, the part of her brain that could reflect wasn't affected. So she could see what was happening to her physical boundary. And you could see that there was not a hard boundary between her skin and the air. That didn't exist. It was all particles, and they were separating. Anyway, the point of me saying this is when I hear things like that, I feel awake. I feel curious. I feel wondering. I feel like all the things I think I know may not exist right now. And there's an ease and a lightness that comes. And I can feel in relationship to the mystery, which as a human experience for me feels very liberating and opening and relaxing, to not think that what I think is true is true. Like, I'm glad that my thoughts are not the end of the road. I'm glad that my understanding is not the end of the road, that there's this whole world of different experiences that exist that lead me into wondering and openness rather than thinking I know what anything is at all.
There's I have seen that TED talk and it's wonderful. Jill Bolt Taylor, and is her name. And Lizzie, this sense that was thinking about this theme about individualism that we've been talking about. So I don't want to for the moment deny, or what's the word, denigrate the individuality, the particularity that is you and the particularity that is me, and all of that. I think the thing that's most present for me as you're talking is that when we're certain of our separateness, which in a way is what we've been taught again and again and again, the contemporary worldview is we're separate, we're accidents, there isn't anything meaningful. The best you can do is be afraid and try to claw out survival, and sort of survival of the fittest. It not only does it separate us from one another, but also from the craft of our hands and the root of the tree and the spring of water and the unborn child and all the things that, and the words spoken by the stars that Ursula Le Guin talks about. What I'm being reminded of from how you're speaking is that when we're afraid like that, when we contract from life, and we have to defend ourselves all the time and be invulnerable, or try to be invulnerable, and try not to be reached by life because, it's just me and I've got to hold myself together. In the middle of our fear, it's very, very easy to become very, very certain and very cynical. I know how the world is. I know how the world works. I know. And in fact, a lot of what we come to see, a lot of the media that comes our way, if we're allowing ourselves to be shaped by other people's choices about the media that comes our way, really, really emphasizes that certainty. We're sort of searching for a way to know and to understand the world. And you're reminding us that when we when we soften that and turn towards the world as a great mystery of which we are a part, of which we're an unfolding part, if we can stand in that possibility, then what happens is that the world comes to us. We get intimate in a way that it's very, very hard to be intimate with life otherwise. And we can support ourselves in being much more open to the multiplicity, to the so many different ways of seeing and experiencing that there are, that my way and your way are different, related but different, but the way of the tree and the way of the earth and the way of communities that are people who live in my street and communities in different parts of the world. We give ourselves a chance for the world to reach us. And I'm really with you about benevolence here. So the world is full of terrors. We know that. And we also know that we humans can propagate terrors on one another. We know that we can do that. I think that we do that when we get very afraid or very superior or very inferior or very definite or very controlling or very... that when we are able to do what Ged is inviting us to do here, to trust that we all are, I'm going to use this phrase again, are syllables of a great word that is being very slowly spoken by the shining of the stars. When we can turn towards the benevolence that has anything exist at all, including us, there's a way back to... So I don't think that goodness in the sense of our taking care of ourselves and one another well is a given, but I think it's always possible because it's fundamental to the nature of existence. We can always reach for it, just like as you were drawing attention to this, that life is a dark place, life may call upon the light. We don't always do that. And one of the reasons we don't always do that is we don't always have a sense of ourselves as part of something benevolent and good and much, much, much bigger than ourselves. So when you talk about Jill Bolt Taylor and that TED Talk, or what Yuval Noah Harari is talking about, how we have constructed the human and social world in which we live, what it reminds us is there are so many other ways of seeing and experiencing what this existence is. And that's what I'm very invited to do from what you're talking is to... And I think for me, it's, Lizzie, it's a heart quality more than it is a thinking kind of thing. Like I'm really good at thinking about things, and I think thinking about things can be very powerful, very necessary. But I notice that my thinking on its own tends to dissect things up into boundaries and differences and all of that. And it's a sort of heart quality to open to... Maybe this is what Jill Bolt Taylor is talking about in her TED Talk, that somehow when our ordinary categorization, I think you said this, like the boundariedness of us gets interrupted, we can start to receive life. And I would not wish the experience that she had upon anyone, but we can start to receive existence itself in this way, in the way of mystery, which I think we so long for. That's why I wanted us to talk about this. I think we long for the intimacy of knowing ourselves as, to be a syllable of a word that's being very slowly spoken means to take up my place as an expression of life, not separate from life, not having to kind of grab life. I already am life, as are you. And maybe the trouble that we have is because it's difficult and frightening and we feel vulnerable, we try to back away from life by controlling it and putting ourselves outside it. But we are it. And that's what we've so rarely seemed to have opportunities to remember, that you and me and the lamp behind you and the tree outside your window and the earth outside mine, we're all a great syllable being spoken very slowly, of a word being spoken very slowly by the stars. My goodness, what a different way to orient.
Absolutely. And I'm just thinking back, Justin, to the talk you went to yesterday, and this conscious practice of making something sacred by paying attention to it and taking it seriously and bringing it into relationship and community and sharing with one another, how this conscious act of doing that is in service of this beautiful phrase that you just used of feeling intimate with life. There are ways that we can, when we, I guess, have a taste of what it means to feel intimate with life, we can then begin to consciously cultivate that. So I'm thinking about living life in service to consciously creating intimacy with life. What are the things I would do? Like you said, we don't necessarily do these things, but if we have the story that it's for the sake of creating intimacy with life, what then are my actions? What then do I want to cultivate? What then do I want to create? How then do I want to serve when I want to be in an intimate experience of life myself, feel part of it, like you're saying, this being a syllable rather than a random observer or something. But if I'm a syllable of this great word that's being spoken by the stars, what's my job? How do I arrange things? What do I do? Who do I call? How do we gather? What texts are there? What music is there? What kind of bodily arrangement might we make between ourselves in order to feel this life flowing through us? And also, what are the things that liberate this, the little collection of words that you use, like being controlling and being fearful and trying to button everything down? What are the things that have us be lighter, that have us be less graspy and more in the flow of receiving and allowing life to be flowing through us as starlight? If I'm an opportunity for starlight to flow, what needs to happen in me in order to clear the way that can happen? And so I'm feeling very held by this invitation to feel what an intimate life feels like, to be intimate with life, and how might things be arranged that I might cultivate that happening for myself and maybe for others too. And that's where this is leading me in my wanderings and my curiosity and the mystery today. And thank you to Ursula Le Guin for that being what she's doing and you're doing for me. I'm really, really grateful.
Parting word from me. The way I take what you've just said folds back into something you very often have talked about, Lizzie, which is receiving. And in so many of the stories that we have about ourselves in our life, we see ourselves as having to control life. Maybe, as we know, with intimacy with any other person, a parent or a sibling or a child or a friend or a loved one, or all those kinds of relational intimacy is receiving as much as it is giving. So I'm left with this question: what do we practice so that we can receive life so it can then be spoken through us? It's a huge invitation. And Ursula Le Guin at the end talks about death. It strikes me that we don't have any control over whether we die, but we do have a lot of influence about whether life will speak its way through us whilst we're here. Yeah. Maybe that's our primary opportunity as well as our primary sacred responsibility. Mm-hmm. So thank you for this very touching conversation, Lizzie. It's such a joy to get to do this together every week. Yeah. And thank you, everybody all of you who are with us. If you want to support us, there's lots of different ways. Come to the Turning Towards Life website, and you can actually literally support us there. Click on the support us button, or you could subscribe to our podcast on one of the platforms, or you could leave us a review certainly on Apple Podcasts. You can leave a review, or you can click subscribe on the YouTube channel. Or you could just tell people who you care about if you think that one of these conversations, or many of them, would be a gift to them. It's wonderful always, isn't it, Lizzie, to know that these conversations find their way out into the world, and they land in people's lives in all kinds of very, very unexpected ways.
Yeah.
So you're very welcome, all of you who are with us, to play some part in one way in having these land somewhere in the world that will be of support to people. Thank you for being with us and supporting us just by your presence and your attention as well. And it's a delight to know you're alongside us. And we'll finish here, and all being well, we will be back out in the world and back in conversation next week. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.